So for our third panel, we're going to dive into the one corner of housing policy that might actually be wonkier than tax policy, and that is the GSEs. And we're going to unpack what exactly is going on with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we really do want to try to elevate the conversation, though, to what's on the line for homeowners and renters. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac underpin the U.S. mortgage system, guaranteeing more than $7.7 trillion in single-family and multifamily mortgage loans. More than 17 years after the companies were placed in conservatorship, senior administration officials are discussing significant changes to their financial and regulatory status. So next up, we'll hear from housing finance experts and practitioners about how changes to Fannie and Freddie could affect the housing market and homeowners and renters nationwide.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie O'Donnell with Bloomberg. This is David Dworkin. This is Mike Fratantoni, and this is Sarah Edelman.
You got it.
Oh, sorry. So as Sarah just said, it's been 17 years since Treasury took over these two companies during the financial crisis to kind of stave off catastrophic losses. There have been many sort of iterations of we should free the companies. David, can you kind of bring us up to speed on where the companies are and sort of how they got here?
Sure. So 17 years, it feels like yesterday. Trauma is like that. The companies collapsed in 2008 in the midst of the mortgage finance crisis, the subprime crisis, and then leading to the Great Recession. And I think one of the most important things that we can say about that is that there's no one answer, easy answer on why that happened. It's very easy. Anybody who tells you there's one reason it happened, particularly because it was affordable housing goals, that's the most ridiculous. But it was an incredibly complicated mix of really bad policies and bad behavior that conspired together to create this. And then the really interesting moment and the serendipitous moment is that we actually passed the Housing and Economic Recovery Act in 2008, which was GSE reform. It was massive GSE reform. And we never think about it as a success because we immediately took advantage of its provision to put them into conservatorship, which saved them from basically going bankrupt and destroying the mortgage finance system as we know it. And we then went into this period for, probably 10 years at least, maybe longer for some people. It's, through yesterday, of trying to come up with an entirely new mortgage finance system. And I worked on that for years at the Treasury Department in the Obama administration and in the Trump administration. And what I learned is that we really screwed up a great system and that there isn't a better way to do this. It is incredibly complicated. There are so many moving parts. And when I started that process, what I found was that I had worked at Fannie Mae for 12 years. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I get to be in the room. And I was shocked at how little I had understood about the company I worked for over a decade. And I felt like that about every year for the next 5 years about the year before. That I was shocked at how little I really fully understood about the mortgage finance system last year. And it's because there are so many moving parts. And so where we are today, I think 17 years in, is that there's a growing realization that the answer to getting them out of conservatorship is to work on the foundation that we created in the Housing and Economic Recovery Act and to pull apart the things that the regulator can do now and the things that still need to be done. And that's much more digestible if we're going to start on this foundation. And we fixed a lot of the things that went into that crisis: toxic mortgages, the race to the bottom among the GSEs, all kinds of systemic failures that we learned from. And so as we move forward, I think I want to take the administration at its word that they want to absolutely ensure that we don't see increases in home ownership rates, in interest rates, or decrease in home ownership. And we can work from there and I think go to that next level. And so that's the process we're in today.
Got it. Sarah, if you could walk us through kind of how important are, this almost seems like a crazy question, but how important are Fannie and Freddie to the housing finance system as it is today?
Yeah, it's a simple question, but a super important one. The American housing finance system that is powered by the GSEs does something kind of magical. It brings in investors from all over the world to buy GSE securities, and that facilitates the long-term fixed rate prepayable mortgage, which is the envy of the world. And what does that mean for home buyers? So Fannie and Freddie combined serve the majority of first-time home buyers. And what this system means is that they can make the biggest investment of their life. It can get chopped up into small, manageable payments over 30 years. And again, this is simple, but it is something that we take for granted at our peril. In terms of the other important value they bring to the market, things that come to mind for me, one, the standard setting. David's right, we have learned a lot, and part of why our mortgage system is safe today is because of the strong underwriting and servicing standards that the GSEs have put in place and that have been adopted by the larger market. The other piece, and this is super underappreciated, and I don't think I appreciated it I didn't appreciate it until I was managing the FHA single family mortgage program, the importance of the technology that they run. The automated underwriting systems that they have built and then have the resources to maintain power the entire mortgage market. Including the government programs, which most people don't know. FHA could not do automated underwriting if they weren't able to put their algorithm on the back of the Fannie Mae desktop underwriter and Freddie Mac's LP. So at the same time, we are in a moment of immense affordability challenges that are not going to be solved by the 30-year fixed rate mortgage alone. The National Association of Realtors put out research earlier this week showing that the median age for a first-time home buyer is now 40 years old. How do we address that? It is a combination of getting the right kind of supply on the market. We need rates to come down. And there's innovations around technology to make sure we are capturing the qualified borrowers that are out there. We also need a stable housing finance system at the center. To the extent we do GSE reform, we sure as heck need to make sure it's right, because what we don't need are higher mortgage costs, a race to the bottom on standards. Those things would make our current situation exponentially worse. So to get back to your initial question, a stable Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are more important maybe than they've ever been, and look forward to further conversations here.
It's crazy, the NAR statistic, the thing that struck me about that is you don't even have to go back to the 70s to see a much lower, it was just in, I think, July 2021 that the age for the median age for a first-time home buyer was 33, and now it's 40 just 4 years later, which really sort of puts into relief kind of how stark a rise in prices we're dealing with. So in terms of next steps for Fannie and Freddie, we've heard a lot of kind of whispers from the Trump White House. We've heard of potentially taking them public while keeping them in conservatorship. I think that was a term of art at one point. Offering shares, doing an IPO, combining the companies. David, what is actually on the table? What works in your opinion, and kind of where should we all be looking?
So for those of you who don't text, all caps is not a whisper.
That is fair.
I think that there's a range of opinions. Some people would call that disagreement. I think the Treasury is taking a very cautious approach, deliberate, and they recently had nearly a dozen group meetings with, I think, almost 100 really thoughtful participants from a huge range of institutions, from the National Urban League and Unidos US and the National Low Income Housing Coalition to the biggest investment banks in the country, and literally everybody in between. And so that's very encouraging. That's exactly how something like this should start. I think that at FHFA, Director Pulte and also Commerce Secretary Lutnick are very committed to moving quickly and are very focused on how much return they can get for the taxpayer. I think that that's an important component of this. And their approach has been to do some kind of a secondary offering. They call it an IPO, but it's actually technically a secondary offering in the marketplace that would be in the neighborhood of $30 billion. There's an interest in the administration of being the biggest of all time. So Aramco is just under 30 billion, I believe, so it would need to be about 30. If that's done right, it actually serves a valuable purpose of, one, bringing some money to the taxpayer, but also establishing a valuation for the enterprises, which is really hard to do any other way. And so for the market to be able to say, this is the notional value of these enterprises, has its own value. But it needs to be a part of a comprehensive approach. And then Congress has to be involved. I do not want Congress creating a housing finance system from scratch. I think that's risky when 535 members of Congress and maybe 4 know what convexity risk is. And I mentioned that to Senator Warner, and he laughed and he said, I'm not sure it's 4. I told him, you don't count because you already knew. But if you don't know, you can Google Silicon Valley Bank or the S&L crisis, and you'll get a good idea of what that looks like.
Or the Federal Reserve.
Or, thank you. Good thing they're not covered under GAAP accounting.
Yeah.
But I think that what Congress needs to do, and I've talked to some of the key players in this. We were with Chairman Flood yesterday, is to separate out what was actually done in HERA, what actually is best done by the regulator and Treasury, and what are the pieces that can't be done by them that absolutely have to be done by Congress. And there's a guarantee. You can call it whatever you want. There's a guarantee. We bailed out Carnival Cruise Lines. I can guarantee you that if they got in trouble again, we're going to bail them out. So given that guarantee, we need to come up with fair pricing for that. How do you structure that? And then you also have the issue of powers that the regulator has that they would no longer have. The ability to tell the enterprises, no, you can't trade market share for price. And there's some other things that are more technical. But these parties working together actually can do this. It is a lot of moving parts, but it is not impossible.
Can I go to why we would want to do this? Because
Yes.
that's the thing that our members talk to us about all the time, and it gets to the 17-year comment. So actually, I overlapped with David at Fannie. I was there for 9 years during the time when they were closer to being private organizations. And if you talk to people who worked there then and people who work there now, it's decidedly different. They have lost more than a step, right? And our members had a sense when they were first put in conservatorship that there was a risk that this was going to happen, that the longer they were in this stasis, things were going to ossify, and they were going to act, to forgive the term, more like bureaucrats, less like business people. And we're seeing that. There's just a less responsiveness. They're less quick to act in response to changing market conditions. There's a concern about innovation, and Sarah and I were talking about this. Well, we don't need them to be innovative. We don't need them to design new things. But what the GSEs do so well is find an innovation in the market and then scale it nationally. No one else has the same ability to do that. And they're just not doing it the same way they used to. So a lot of our members are just feeling frustrated and thinking, well, if they were out of conservatorship, or if they got this sort of a little bit of a taste of what it's like to be a private company again, would they start acting like business people again? And it's changed from administration to administration. I think last administration, there was a lot of checking every single decision before you went. This one, speed of decision making has not seemed to be a problem. Directionality seems to be a question of, is there a strategy behind these quick decisions? So I think that that's sort of the underlying motivation of this is frustrating where we are right now. Could it be better if they started acting more like businesses again?
I want to stick with you for a second, Mike. So that's all a very fair point, and the directionality, it does seem like you'd have to sort of sort that out before you can answer some of these questions.
Yeah, when you're lost, don't go faster.
Yes. But is that you weighing in on the Federal Reserve fog situation? But anyway, I wanted to get a sense from you about what these changes could mean for both single-family and multifamily lenders.
So I think, again, I talked about the positives of if you get them, again, sort of tightening their shoelaces once again, moving a little faster in terms of the way they're conducting business, that's the positive. There's a whole lot of risk, though, right? That I guess we're approaching the Winter Olympics here, right? And I always sort of compare it to, you can do that triple Lutz and hope you land it exactly right and score, a perfect score. But if you don't, you wind up on the ice, right? And there's lots of ways we can wind up on the ice here. And what that shows up, to David's point, was higher mortgage rates, more volatile mortgage rates, less ability to access the market. And I would sort of add on to Sarah's comments about their importance in the market right now. Fannie and Freddie are, at this point, the second and third largest issuers in the agency MBS space. I think that's surprising to people. Ginnie Mae is by far the largest issuer in today's market. Part of that's because we're in a purchase-dominated market right now, and the GSEs are always much more of a presence in a refi boom. But it's also because FHA, VA, USDA are just doing tremendous work to provide financing to first-time
But they're government
buyers.
bureaucrats.
See, there is.
Very responsive
But
government
under
bureaucrats.
certain FHA commissioners and FHA staff, you all did extraordinarily well. But yeah, so Ginnie's the leading player in the agency MBA space right now, and their share would go much higher if there's a misstep in this exercise, right? And there's so many potential ways we could wind up on the ice.
And that's a result that almost nobody wants, which is that the government is controlling the entire mortgage finance system. And it's not a slight against anybody, but that just isn't going to be agile. And I think agility is one of the most important things you get when you have a robust and successful mortgage finance system, because then it's able to respond to different economic conditions. And that's one of the things we get. I think, going back to something Sarah said, the most important thing we get from the GSEs is this mortgage product. And we also just refer to it as the 30-year rate fixed year mortgage, because that's kind of its brand. But what we're really talking about is a mortgage that is amortizing, fully amortizing. So you're actually paying down the value of the mortgage at the same time that you're paying the interest. It is prepayable, which means that you get to refinance when you want without a penalty. That's a huge benefit for consumers. It means that it is, long-term, and that you can actually lock your rate, which we do because of the TBA market. That's also a big deal. And ultimately, what it really gets to is the fact that the consumer is simply the credit risk. Mm-hmm. Pay your mortgage and you're good. And the alternative to that is that the consumer ends up managing their own convexity risk. And convexity and mortgage interest rates are hard enough for sophisticated financial institutions to manage. I don't want every person on my block having to manage theirs alone. And I think that's also one of the beautiful things we have in this pretty elegant system.
Yeah. Can I speak to the other side of that for a second, though? Because if you look just at data in the past couple of years, during the pandemic, refi boom, 70-year lows and 30-year mortgage rates, not surprising, people were getting 30-year loans. We had about a 2 or 3% ARM share in most weeks during that time period. We're up to about a 10% ARM share right now, and a lot of that's because the yield curve's gotten steeper, the Fed's cut their overnight rate, longer-term rates haven't moved, ARMs are much more attractive. You can get a 5 or 7 year ARM for about a full percentage point below what you get for a 30-year fixed rate, and people are responding to that.
My first mortgage was a 7-year ARM.
It's a fantastic product
Yeah.
if you're not going to be in the house for
Were
more
you
than
40?
7 years.
Were you 40 years old?
Yes, were you?
Not 40 years old. And I'm not going to tell you what year it was either.
But I do think, again, if there's a slip up in this GSE transition, you're going to see a whole lot more mortgages going on bank balance sheets, and they're going to be adjustable. Post Dodd-Frank, I don't worry about that, to David's point, because a 5 or 7 year fix, that's a really great product for most potential home buyers. But I do think, again, if things go wrong, both the banking system, and we'll need to think about capital regulation of the banking system to make sure that works well, and the Ginnie Mae sort of network is going to take a lot more business. Just one point on the multifamily side, the GSE multifamily business work very, very well. They're very different. They're very competitive. Wouldn't want to mess that up either.
You talked to multifamily policy maker. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, the other reason why it just wouldn't be sustainable to shift all the business over to the government is, one, infrastructure and technology. I mean, the FHA single-family business has lost 40% of its staff this year. It has a shoestring budget. As I mentioned, it's still using the GSE's automated underwriting system. It would not be able to effectively pick it up. And the other piece is, I am very grateful Dodd-Frank is in place. I know some people are very happy with the direction of the CFPB. I would argue there's not much of a cop on the block right now, especially for the non-bank sector, which does the overwhelming majority of mortgage lending these days. And so this sort of this alternative scenario is a bit worrisome.
Yeah, you can have a lap dog, or a guard dog, or an attack dog. And I think during the Biden administration, we had an attack dog, and I don't think that works. Previously, I think we've had the equivalent of a guard dog in the CFPB, and right now I don't think there's even a dog there. So it's just the gates are open and people are too afraid to mess with them, but that doesn't last forever. And so I think the key to having good regulation is that it's properly modulated. And one of the things that's interesting is I'll say one thing about multifamily is that multifamily policymakers always come up to me and be like, "You didn't talk about multifamily again." And my response is, "That's because you're not broken." And so I don't want to fix you. We have a pretty elegant multifamily financing system, and I'd like to keep it that way. But the key here is to find that right balance. And it's an art, not a science, and that pendulum swings. But it's one of the things that's going on now is that lenders are very nervous about the fact that they're not getting regulatory guidance, and they're coloring inside the lines on purpose because they recognize these laws haven't gone away. The regulators have gone away.
And 3 years from now, it could come swinging wildly back.
Absolutely, and their legal exposure is leveraged even more. And so there's an interest in having good, responsible regulation. During the first year of the Trump administration, when I worked for Steve Mnuchin, the call was, we need to eliminate Dodd-Frank, get rid of Dodd-Frank. And so Secretary brought together all of these working groups, and all of these people came in, and many people in this room may have been in one of those meetings to share their views on Dodd-Frank. And at the end of this process, one of the things was very interesting was I had people coming up to me on the side at the meetings. They wouldn't say it in the room, but they wanted to make sure somebody from Treasury heard it, which was, I hate this, but for God's sakes, don't change that. And that's the beauty of Dodd-Frank, is that after the first Trump administration, 80% of Dodd-Frank is still in place. And that you might not have gotten that if you'd conferenced the bill. And so we have to be careful that I hate this phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm a grandfather now. I think that's a really gross saying. But I don't have a replacement for it yet, so if you have any ideas, see me after. But we want to be careful that we don't do that, because getting it right is, really essential to avoiding catastrophe.
That makes sense. To kind of drill down to the specific on sort of what it means for homeowners, renters, I'd love to kind of poll all three of you on just What are some risks here, some opportunities? Sarah, if you'd like to start.
Sure. You know, the major risk from my perspective of a partial or full return to private companies is that the GSEs become more focused on producing returns for investors than they are focused on the long-term stability of the entities and the mission responsibilities that they have. In my mind, the ways in which that would happen, one is a focus on higher return business, so serving wealthier borrowers at the expense of lower moderate income, or designing bad products that can expand market share but aren't stable over the long term. So those are the big, that and then the ability, potentially prioritizing working with larger lenders because it's just so much easier sometimes than smaller lenders. On the opportunity side, you know, it's so funny, Mike, we have similar perspectives, but we come at it from a very different path. You know, I think that for me, what we've seen over the last 8 or 9 months at the enterprises with deep and swift changes in governance, staff, and a pullback on the single-family mission is the biggest reason why we do need to have a real conversation about taking them out of what are essentially nationalized status. And so I think that does need to happen. The question is when, how, and to what end. I do have concerns about layering on top of the enterprises, how they exist today, a new imperative to generate profits for investors. And I think if there is a plan that if they are taken out of conservatorship, or if there's sort of a quasi, either a stock offering or whatever, while they're in conservatorship, we should seriously, and you all might disagree with me on this, we should seriously consider limiting their returns like a utility to provide some stability during this period and make sure that they stay focused on their core responsibilities.
I would definitely disagree with that. And the
I thought you
reason
might.
is because they always operated on I mean, it would be so boring if we agreed on everything, but
We do agree about the dog and the
Oh, for
CFPB,
sure. They've always operated on very narrow margins where they make money is in volume. And so what we want them to be able to do is operate on responsible volume. I don't think the issue is how much money they make on the individual mortgages. The issue is that they shouldn't be chasing volume like a tech startup growth stock. And there was a lot of that going on in the 90s. And some of us in this room did very well as a result of that. But it was a train that, you know, didn't have a station, just a cliff. And so I think that's going to be really critical. We have a de facto utility model now because the government is running them as a utility. And when the Supreme Court stripped them stripped FHFA of its independence, what we saw is then FHFA got on the pendulum. And so in the Biden administration, if you're a progressive, you're probably very happy with the decisions that were made. I liked a lot of the decisions that were made there. I disagreed with others. But many of them were political decisions that past regulators did not feel comfortable making. Now you have a regulator that's still on the pendulum, but it has swung the other way. And now we're on that end of the pendulum. And a lot of us don't like some of the things that are being done. Others may make sense. But that is not a sustainable model for a highly complicated, sophisticated financial institution. And so when they're responsible to a risk-weighted return and have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, there's stability in that. And I would much rather have the regulator managing the outside of that credit box than actually running the entire enterprise. We literally do have that right now, where the regulator
and I
is
agree
running the
that it is a sort of a safety measure. It is not the ideal. I agree with you on that. The problem is that we are in the middle of a process that despite the very laudable roundtables that Treasury held, which I think were fantastic, and David's right, they covered the entire spectrum. There's very little transparency about how this process is actually going to look. And what, if they remain in conservatorship, what investors will be promised to buy stock in a company that is still under government ownership? And I'm not trying to be conspiracy theory, but there's very little transparency. And so when I am suggesting that we need a safety measure to make sure that this process, until it can be done fully correctly and in a transparent manner, sort of avoid the worst possible outcomes.
Yeah, and let me tie together a couple of these points, particularly something that you said, Sarah, about just the level of executive and senior level turnover at both Fannie and Freddie over the past couple of years, particularly over the past several months, is something that our members are really, truly worried about, right? Yeah. That, to David's point, this is really complicated stuff. And you have folks who have spent careers developing, particularly, talk like an economist here, specific human capital to do just that job that you only do at Fannie Freddie. And they were kicked out or left because of frustration with the situation. And again, I have members sort of all the time worried about that, worried about, is there going to be enough sort of, again, intellectual capital there to continue to run them well? And then particularly now, if you take the training wheels off and they're being run more like private companies again, are they going to have the skill set they need to be successful? But let me throw one other sort of economist framing for you out there. You know, when they're more private, the idea is they're trying to maximize profits just like any other company out there, right? But subject to a handful of constraints that not everybody else has. One is they operate only in the secondary market, and that is really crucial from our perspective. We call it a bright line between primary market activities and secondary market activities. And both GSEs for decades always had the temptation to put their hand in the cookie jar and say, well, you know, maybe I want into that part of the primary market business because there's some money over there and we can do it really efficiently because we're big. Always got to be on guard against that. Second is it's right in their charter. They got to be providing liquidity all markets all time. So they can't decide I'm out of Florida because home prices are dropping in Florida right now. Right? They can't do that. And I think that's really critical. It makes it harder, right? Because they're providing a credit guarantee in places where prices are dropping. Another one is the commitment to affordable housing, and that's in the goals, duty to serve, other. You can argue about whether that is calibrated correctly right now, but it's an important part of the constraints under which they operate, and that's necessary going forward.
Being in all markets at all times is the heart and soul of why we have GSEs. I do not want to have a recession in Florida and then double down on it by not being able to have a housing market in Florida. And that cross-subsidization across geographies and economies is incredibly important. And I would not want a regional bank to be responsible for doing that. I am perfectly comfortable having a competently run GSE doing that. And part of that is the size and scope that they bring to it. It's really an important point, and we forget that. You know, we take for granted the things they do that are so important. We also have a really bad habit of trying to solve for the last crisis after we solve for it, and that's all we think about until we get into the new crisis. Sometimes that looks like 3 crises ago, and it's just, you know, we need a better way of thinking about that, because I'm not worried about 2005. You know, I am very worried about 1985, and that's, you know, the reality of where we are today.
And just to double click on something Mike said, you know, just for folks who aren't reading Housing Wire every day, you're lucky.
Who's that?
Is there anybody here?
There's some people in here who don't
Their
read
whole
Housing Wire.
subscription
There's
base
some
is here.
non-subscribers here, I know it. At Fannie Mae alone, over the last 2 weeks, they lost the CEO, the general counsel, the head of ethics, and the larger part of the ethics team, the head of single family. The president fired the FHFA inspector general. And these are on top of all of governance and staffing changes that have happened all year. And it puts us in a vulnerable position from which to try and stabilize and and reform the GSEs. And I think that's as important as anything else we're going to talk about today. And I don't hear it talked about that much. So I wanted to double click.
No, I mean,
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to mention any of the things that a normal person could assume based on what you just said. I'm just going to hope it doesn't happen and that I'm wrong. But it's when you think about investors and maximizing the taxpayer value, if I'm an investor looking at buying, shares in some kind of a public offering, I'm making a bet on the future earnings of these companies. And I need to know they're being well run by people who are deeply experienced and that they have internal controls. And if I don't think that, then I am not going to pay very much for that stock. Now, I may bet on the hedge that, well, if I pay, a price earnings ratio of 1, I'm going to do okay. But I'm certainly not going to bet that it's going to go up to 10 or 20.
One thing that has been happening as all of this discussion has played out are regulatory changes that sort of eat around the edges of what the GSEs do. So we have the LIHTC cap was raised. The equitable housing finance plans were scrapped. And they reduced the overall affordable housing goals. I would love to get a sense from each of you on kind of what you make of these changes, what they portend, and whether you think they were a good idea.
I can start on the goals. We thought that they were pushed a little too high in the Biden administration, and that always leads to really kind of unproductive behavior, where both Fannie and Freddie were pushing on their customers pretty hard to find, LIP or VLIP loans, so low-income, very low-income loans that just weren't available to these lenders, and requiring each of them to hit a specific goal. And so that sort of was just a symptom to us that they were probably a little too high. Scaling them back a little bit, maybe they're scaled back too far. Don't have a sense on that right now. But I think they are very important. Like I said, it is really a crucial function that they are supporting financing for affordable housing. The goals are a tough nut to crack because I'm a forecaster. Forecasters are wrong by profession. That's what we do. We're visibly, publicly wrong all the time. And this is a forecasting exercise, and so it is tough to modulate it correctly.
The nice thing about the way the goals are set up, though, is even if the forecasting is wrong, they're ultimately measured against what the market, did they keep pace with the market? 9
months later, though, unfortunately, yeah. The way HMDA grows.
Yeah, that's true. They may have been a bit high. They were reduced. This is a second reduction, and now they are the lowest they've been since FHFA. For on the single-family side, for low income and very low income, they're the lowest. The proposed rule is the lowest they've been since FHFA was created, and lower than what the GSEs have achieved every year in the past decade. And so I would say they've swung the wrong way. One thing, there's sort of there's been a little bit of a rhetoric out there pitting the goals against the middle class. And so yesterday I spent a little bit of time looking at teachers' salaries. So I started in where I live, outside of DC. A teacher earns 62% of the area median income. So if she bought a condo using a conventional loan, she'd help them meet their low income goal. Of course, I live in a high cost area, but the same is true in rural Kentucky. I looked at Robertson County, a very rural area in Kentucky where the average teacher salary is 31% of the area median income. So that would actually, if someone bought a home using conventional financing there, they'd help the GSEs meet their VLI target. I think you could have a similar story around first responders, city workers, farmers, all the folks who are the backbone of our middle class. Look, you shouldn't have to be a hero to be able to get a mortgage, but I just wanted to share that it's sort of, I think that the way in which the goals are described is really a bit at odds with people's realities. And a side note, if we think GSE reform is hard, you should try teaching a classroom of 25 6-year-olds how to read. I had my parent-teacher conference this morning. Maybe next on your bucket list, David. So the lowering of the goals wasn't implying you should leave your job, though. I was just thinking about We need you. I meant the grandkids and the baby with the, anyway, it didn't
The
work,
nice thing about
sorry.
being a grandparent is you never have to go to a teacher conference again. You like
But-
sitting in those little tiny chairs?
No,
I
I don't.
Totally.
But the basic point is that the housing goals and duty to serve, they're only as good as their enforcement. And what they've proposed is frankly shocking in terms of the affordable housing goals.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I wanted to make one just point on multifamily, where I think we have had a bit of a belt and suspenders thing going on in the multifamily for a while, because you have not just the goals, but also the cap on how much multifamily lending could do, and then all kinds of twists and turns about how that cap is defined. Does it include affordable? Does it not include affordable? And I think there is some sort of sensible simplification that could be done there, because as you all know, most of multifamily is small A affordable anyway, so getting them more active in that business is probably better rather than worse.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm not losing any sleep over having a negligible, functionally meaningless, very low income goal for homeownership.
Yeah.
I think if you're very low income, I'm much more worried about you being able to maintain that house and the things that happen in the house, especially one that's affordable to you, when the roof needs to be replaced or the windows are leaking and your electric bill is 5 times what it should be. I'd much rather have our investment focus on having quality, sustainable rental housing for people who are very low income. I absolutely think that if you're low and moderate income, you should be able to realize the American dream and without the risk of it becoming a nightmare. And so the goals are important, but they don't really lead the market. I mean, this is about, are the enterprises adequately and appropriately serving their lenders? The lenders are making these loans, and they have to be doing their job. Fannie and Freddie are terrible at product innovation. I used to do that there, and I was terrible at it, and I think I'm pretty good. And, you'd come up with a new product that made perfect sense to you as somebody who's never originated a single loan. And then, a year later, you'd be like, wow, I created 400 loans on a multi-trillion-dollar book of business.
David, I don't think that's true.
I
I think that's true for some of the smaller markets, but you think about Home Ready, you think about Home Possible, you think about just the standard bread and butter mortgages.
Yes.
I think they've been pretty effective.
Those are brands, but the underwriting that underlie them came from lenders. And I think what happens is if you listen to your lenders and you know your customers, which is how they refer to the lenders, that you will find who's doing really good, innovative work. Yeah. And then your job is to scale that. And so pilots matter, listening to your lenders. I doubt there's a single underwriting element of either one of the most successful products at the enterprise that didn't start with a lender. And the job, I think, of the enterprises, when they're doing their job well, is to say, hey, look at this regional bank or this IMB in Des Moines who's got a product that's really serving less expensive mortgages for low, moderate income home buyers. Let's make that a pilot and open it up to 10 other lenders. And then if it's successful, it disappears. It's not even a product anymore. It just is in the underwriting engine. That's the gold standard, is that the product actually disappears because it's just part of how we underwrite mortgages. And that's what they do really, really well. And when they start trying to say, trying to guess what the customer wants, I mean, the real customer, the borrower, they don't know who those people are. And if you're a senior executive there, you probably don't even have a mortgage anymore.
Yeah, that is quite a point. That is an important point. Well, speaking of pilot products, I wanted to get a sense from you guys. So the most recent, as we're discussing, whether they're going to go free from conservatorship or not, President Trump has recently been sort of pressuring them to, in his words, get big home builders going. One, what did you take that to mean? And two, do you think there is a role for the GSEs to play in expanding housing supply?
Definitely a role for them to play in expanding housing supply. It needs to be done in partnership with home builders. home builders make money by building homes.
Right.
They want to build more homes. And the underserved market right now is for low and moderate income home buyers, and they want to be doing those mortgages, building those homes. And those homes have very tight margins already. And so what we need to be doing is sitting down with home builders and saying, what do you need? And how can we help you? Not what are you going to do for me? And so I think that I am hopeful that at the end of this process, we're going to come up with a way to really help home builders be more successful, serving a broader range of people without pushing so far into markets that are already saturated, because you have to be really careful about which markets you're adding homes to, because they're all unique. And it's that location thing. And we can actually be very successful. But if we just say, cut your margins and build more houses wherever you build them and give me a big number, we know how that story ends. Not good. I think it's called the Resolution Trust Corporation. There was a lot of AD&C in the RTC, and I don't want to go back there. I definitely want to build more homes.
And I think the point that I think David summed up perfectly what the GSEs are when they're at their best, which is partnering with regional and local banks and finding what works and scaling it up. And I think there's an opportunity here. And the richest partnerships may actually be with smaller builders that don't have a mortgage lending arm. Maybe there's some kind of pilot with a regional bank, small builders, federal home loan banks. Like there could be something interesting there. I would also point to what did Ms. Brundage call it, the spicy remarks from Senator Warner about the neighborhood, but he concluded his remarks with a pitch for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, and this is a very strongly supported bipartisan proposal that would help to close that, to help make starter home production more economical. So I don't think this is something that the GSEs, certainly on their own, can solve.
Yeah. Let me just emphasize one point David alluded to, that if you look in 20% of the major metros in the country right now, home prices are declining. So that would not be a place to put a lot more supply right now, right? In those same markets, rents are declining, so there's a whole lot of multifamily supply still coming on as well. We shouldn't be setting policy for market conditions at a point in time. We should be setting them so that it's sensible over the course of an economic cycle. So there are lots of things you can do to, over time, make it easier to bring new supply online when it makes sense to do so. But just a little bit of a warning, just tap the brakes a little bit, that we don't need as much supply in probably half the country as you would have thought even a year ago, particularly given immigration policy changes, some of the new demographic projections. But we just don't quite need as much as you might have thought. That's one point. A second, I agree that I think that the big builders sort of got this, that they know how to run their business, and they're going to be tapping the brakes, pushing the accelerator in those markets appropriately. I think there is room to help smaller builders, and one of the things we've asked Fannie and Freddie is to do things like extend the time period for rate locks, because that's really, really important on construction loans. But I think there's sort of stuff around the edges. The last part is, banks are so important in construction lending. And so if we're opening up Basel III Endgame and looking at potential changes in bank capital standards, this will be a place to look. Agree that AD&C lending has been a real problem in the past, but banks have learned from those experiences. So I think getting them sort of equipped to be more responsive to support construction when we're in market conditions that would support that, I think would be sensible.
When I'm driving through a small town with sidewalks full of people, I'm going 23 and a 25. When I'm on the highway and the speed limit is 55, I might be going 70. I'm not going to hurt anybody in either one of those scenarios. And I think the important thing when we think about home building, when you said 20% of the markets you're seeing home building, home prices decline, what I heard you say is we still need to do more in 80% of the markets. And the key here is to know which markets are which, and to calibrate and adjust your strategy. That's the beauty of the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, is that the lost component of this are all of these communities where home prices are actually too low, which doesn't make sense in the context of everything else we've said. But the reality is that if home prices are low enough on an older, dilapidated house or in a neighborhood where there's been vacancy or abandonment in the current or in the past, that what we really need to do is close that gap, because the price of rehabbing the house or the price of building a new house on a vacant lot is actually higher than the home is going to be worth, at least for the near term. And so we've taken that entire community out of the market, and that's an important piece of this. Again, we have to look at a market. It's very complicated, and so we can't just have one solution.
Mm-hmm. I am going to ask you guys a forecasting question, so I'm going to go to Mike first, but it's a two-part. So we are in the middle of a government shutdown, so in some ways this seems like an absurd question, but what are the chances you think we'll see legislation from Congress on GSE reform in the next year? And then looking forward to a year from now, where do you think the GSEs will be? Where would you like them to be? So, Mike.
Yeah. So relying upon our lobbyist expertise, expect zero chance of legislation out of Congress, but 90% chance that there will be hearings, that the leadership both in the House and Senate want the administration to go first, want the Treasury and FHFA, as a result of all these meetings they've had, to come out with some initial thoughts and then have Congress weigh in, because again, these are congressionally chartered enterprises. The Congress is going to want to weigh in on how we move forward. I think, and listening to the president, listening to the folks that work for him, they really want to do this equity offering. So I'm going to be surprised if they don't at least lay out plans to do it over the next 12 months. I think, if it goes well, I'm not expecting any huge differences in the way Fannie and Freddie are operating. If it goes poorly, again, it could be another headwind. But I think these folks are sort of savvy enough that if it looks like it's going to go poorly, they're going to pull it back.
I'm just feeling grateful that it's not my job to be a forecaster, because this is a hard time to forecast much. My knee jerk would be no, just from many of us still have trauma from a decade ago when they tried, or a little over a decade ago. But on the other hand, Congress is full of surprises. And this year, they've had a couple of pleasant surprises on the housing front. So I would say probably not, with a little side of, who knows, maybe.
I think it's hard for Congress to do anything without an action-forcing event, especially in something this complicated. I do think that if they do a secondary offering, and which could easily happen in the first quarter, maybe the second quarter of next year, that is going to put enormous pressure on Congress to do something. And one of the things that we would see is that in Dodd-Frank, restriction was added that any sale of the enterprise's assets that the government owns, the warrants in particular, that the money can only go to deficit reduction. It cannot be used for anything else. And that, it's a very simple clause. There is no wiggle room with that. And so for Congress to see tens of billions of dollars coming in that they can't touch, that's a pretty good incentive to make some adjustments there, because it's a lot of money that you can put to good use. Although deficit reduction is certainly good use, you also have a scenario where if you do it in tranches and you're allowed to apply it to capital, every time you do a tranche, the next tranche is worth more. And so if, you could have the enterprises worth maybe $400 billion today, but if you structured it like an investment bank would, which they're talking to them over a several year period of time, it could be at least double that as the market absorbs it and as their capital increases, and the government's role ends up becoming more obvious. So I definitely don't rule it out. And I think that that's, in the best case scenario, a conservative, thoughtfully done public offering could actually result in well-designed and narrowly constructed GSE reform by Congress. That is the best case scenario.
I was going to say, that's
I
the
say
most
that in the
optimistic
context of a
I've
government.
ever heard David talk. That's good.
I say that in the context of a government that literally is incapable of operating at its most basic level. So, I'm happy to bet your money that could happen, not so much mine.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two questions if anyone has a question for the panelists. I'm not seeing any, but the lights are kind of bright. Okay, it looks like no questions. Well, thank you guys so much, and thank you three so much for such a spirited discussion. It was great.